Very warm welcome to Vasyl Vladimirovich Myroshnychenko.
Professor Pakulski, thank you very much for the introduction, and I think the association will have to thank you for making sure that I'm here with you today speaking. I was recently in Tasmania, that was back in January, and we had a great dinner hosted by the governor of Tasmania, and where we sat next to each other with Jan Pakulski, and we had a great conversation about everything. I think we covered many different topics, and I've really enjoyed it very much. And he asked me if I could come and join and speak to you, and I said, of course, I will be delighted to do that. I know that you're spread out in Australia, but you all have Polish links one way or another, and of course, I'm happy to see Lukasz Graban, who I see here in Canberra pretty much every week. We do lots of things together. And we've organized several exhibitions, spoke at different panels together, and we also understand there will be a Polish ambassador coming soon. But we worked a lot with the previous ambassador as well. But we really appreciate all the support provided by the Polish embassy here. But also, what's more important is, of course, the support of the Polish people to the Ukrainians, and this has been phenomenal. And I think this is really something that we really are very grateful for that. And all those 5 million Ukrainians who came to Poland when the war started, and just seeing and observing it, it's kind of interesting. I remember about 3 weeks before the war, I was invited by the Polish American Chamber of Commerce to do a talk. And I have a good friend. His name is Marek Matraszek. He runs a public affairs company in Warsaw. And I've been working with him for over 10 years. I think more than that, almost 15 years, actually. So before I became an ambassador, I was in the private sector. So I was on public affairs and comms side. And Marek invited me and said, look, let's do this event with the Polish American Chamber of Commerce. And we just speak there on a panel and discuss, if war can happen. Is it what's going to happen? What if it happens? Where are we going to go? And I remember participating in that. We had like 200 or 300 people, mostly international companies, mostly American companies operating in Poland, discussing this different scenarios. And I remember talking. I said, look, if the war going to start, we're going to see millions and millions of people flooding Poland and going to Europe, and nobody will be able to stop them. And it's now that I look back at that, I didn't believe what I was saying. Though I was looking at it purely from a standpoint of theoretical exercise, I still could not believe that Russians would invade Ukraine at such a scale and in such an intensity that it would actually happen. So on one hand, we all kind of looked at that is possible, but on the other hand, we could never fully admit or even believe into that kind of war happening. And it did happen, and it did result in the largest exodus of people since the Second World War. And now we have about 1.5 million Ukrainians in Poland. Many others have spread out throughout Europe, over 1 million in Germany, and then many other countries are having Ukrainians, mostly women with children. And this is, of course, extremely difficult and is creating many different problems. We have another 9 million people who are internally displaced, and it's a huge humanitarian catastrophe. Russians are deliberately destroying our civilian infrastructure, destroying power generation, electricity distribution, water supplies, and now 50% of Ukraine's energy infrastructure is being destroyed by now, and they keep on sending missiles and drones, often hitting and destroying hospitals, schools, but most importantly, all the critical infrastructure, which is important for our business and for our economy to go on, right? Look, I don't know how I should structure. To be frank, I was looking more on a kind of a Q&A session. Of course, I can talk for another 10 minutes or so, but I think it will be better if you think about some questions you want to ask. And I would be happy to take any question. Just introduce yourself, ask the question, and I will just talk about that. But look, you're all following the news. You all understand what's happening. often people ask me when this is going to end, right? Nobody knows when this is going to end. And I think the right question is not to ask when this is going to end. The right question to ask is what we can do to help Ukraine win. And it's pretty clear that what we are seeing, we're seeing the invasion of Ukraine, invasion which is done by a nuclear power, which is done by a permanent member of the United Nations, the Security Council of the United Nations, blatantly violating the UN Charter and just violating any kind of moral, ethical, or any other legal issues, and just invading the country, and killing civilians, killing and destroying the country. What, in a way, kind of the lessons we see so far is that everybody has underestimated the power of Russia. I think we all now understand that Russian army is not that mighty, is not that powerful, and therefore it's a myth that's been destroyed. Also, we underestimated the resilience of the Ukrainian people and the resilience of the international coalition to help Ukraine. And that actually works both ways. Firstly, Ukrainians have demonstrated that we are ready to fight. We are ready to die defending the country. We've demonstrated we got united, no matter what, all united around one goal of defeating the enemy. And I think there was no one else but Vladimir Putin who really created a very strong sense of Ukrainian identity, which he's now created a political nation, a true political European nation in the heart of Europe, where Ukrainians, of different ethnic groups, of different religious groups, everybody is united currently fighting the Russians, and it's been pretty much clear since the very beginning, and it's really phenomenal for me to look at this and see it happening. Russia has bombed all the Russian-speaking cities of Ukraine, and they got the ones who suffered most. And I think for all those Russian-speaking people of Ukraine, they've realized, well, it's been already for 9 years now for starters, right? So we know there was no kind of big fascination with Russia anyways. But I think with this invasion, it became pretty clear that there is no future for Russia in Ukraine whatsoever. I mean, Putin lost the war when he invaded Ukraine. Russia has lost Ukraine forever. It will never be back. We'll never be able to forgive them for what they've done, and I think that's permanent. And it's there is no way back, especially in this war. In this war, which is everything is on the iPhone, right? Everything is recorded. Everything is online. You can watch it live as well. You can see we have the record of all the war crimes committed. Everything is available to everybody. And therefore, it will be difficult. We'll never forget it. We'll never forgive it. And of course, all those who have perpetrated that, they will have to be held accountable. And Ukraine is working on an international special tribunal, and we call on different governments to join it. Many have joined already, to keep the political and military leadership of Russia accountable for what they've done. Some of the kind of situation on the ground, what we have, since the outbreak of the war, Russians have been able to occupy large parts of Ukraine, but we've been able to drive them out from 50% of that. So in April of last year, we repelled Russians from northern Ukraine, from Kyiv. Later on in September, we managed to repel them from Kharkiv region in the east. And then eventually in November, we kicked them out of Kherson. So we managed to liberate 50% of the territories which they have occupied since the outbreak of the war. So it basically took many failures on the Russian side, but also a strong unity of the allies. And we now have allies of 50 countries which are supporting us. This international alliance was driven by the US and British government to a large extent, but also then supported by the EU in total, and then individual governments of the European Union, and of course joined by the governments of Australia and New Zealand, and all the G7 countries, including Japan, have contributed in one way or another, supporting Ukraine either militarily or financially, or providing other assistance which is necessary. We now see different governments announcing multi-year programs. Like the government of Norway recently announced a plan to support Ukraine with 7.5 billion euro for the next several years. The same Japan announced, I think, almost a $5.5 billion US dollar fund to help Ukraine rebuild the infrastructure. So we see different governments committing and providing money. In terms of military assistance, the biggest country in continental Europe is Germany in terms of supplies of weapons. And then generally in Europe, it's France, then, you know, so it's US, Britain, Germany, then I think it's France, and then other countries in terms of military supplies and assistance to Ukraine. Look, it's tough. I mean, it's tough, and there are many different things we'll have to deal with. One of them is, of course, huge trauma for the society. And you know, I was recording one webinar today with the Australian National University with the National Security College for 1 hour. So I had a conversation about this, and we talked a bit about this, and something we still cannot fully grasp of what are the implications of how the entire society is going to be affected as we move on, right? All those people who've been in combat, who lost their lives, who've seen other people killed, who lost their limbs, devastated families, broken up families, you know, traumatized children, and how this will play out. You know, the grandmother of my wife, she's 93 and 94. She still remembers Nazi occupation she was a child back then, right? She was traumatized by what she's seen, right? Her generation was traumatized by the famine, which was artificially done by the Soviets in Ukraine and killed over 5 million people. Ukraine is still traumatized by that experience from 1932-33. We all remember the Second World War, and during the Second World War, Ukrainian casualties in the Soviet Union were the highest, because most of the battlefield was here in Ukraine, right? And still, you know, we still live through that trauma. And this war brings it like to a totally new level. And to imagine something happening of that same scale, and never again, right? But it's lest we forget, but it's there. 300,000 Russian troops are deployed in Ukraine. Russians are using supersonic missiles, thermobaric bombs. They're using the most sophisticated missiles you can imagine, you know, destroying our infrastructure, destroying lots of other things in Ukraine. And of course, they're using nuclear weapons as a threat. They've occupied the largest nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, called Enerhodar nuclear power plant. That one nuclear power plant has 6 reactors. And one of those, the size of that reactor was the one that blew up in Chernobyl in 1986, right? And they kept it, and they use it as a launching pad to shoot missiles out from that nuclear power plant. Nobody can shoot back, right? Because of security reasons. But already twice that nuclear power plant was shut off from electricity supply, and it had to kick in the generators and have the supply of electricity. Also, they are drying up the Kakhovka basin, and this is a basin out there on the Dnipro River, and that nuclear power plant is using water from that basin to cool it down. Now that's being dried up because they have artificially shut down some of the channels, and that's also another threat. But anyways, look, there are many challenges, right? And of course, we have to work on solving them as they are. I was able to go to Ukraine 4 times last year. So I came here when the war already started. So I was still in Kyiv when the war started. I came here a month later. I was able to go back in June. I was there in July with the Prime Minister. Later on, I was there in October. And more recently, I was there for annual ambassadors meeting back in December. So I was able to kind of see it with my own eyes in terms of, well, of course, I didn't go further to the east, but I was in Kyiv. I was in the capital, and I went to Mykolaiv in the south. It was part of the field trip with all the ambassadors going to Mykolaiv. But that was very important for me to be able to go back to Ukraine 4 times last year. And long trip. Also, the logistics is very complicated, but now Way in, way out is all through Poland for me. I fly into Warsaw. I usually spend the night there, then take another flight to Rzeszów. And from Rzeszów, I take a taxi to the border and I cross border on foot. And my brother meets me on the other side. And then I go and visit my parents in Western Ukraine. And then I take a night train and go over to Kiev, right? So that's been my trip in and out already, 4 times at least. And the same route pretty much. Sometimes I stay for 2 nights in Warsaw just because this trip from Australia is so long. So you need to decompress. Sometimes you just need 2 nights there before you can, carry on. Well, the trip, right? The trip. But yeah, well, if we could fly into Kiev, it would be easier, but now we can't. So it makes the whole trip much longer. But anyways, this is what we are. Look, I would like to let you ask questions and I'll be happy to answer them.
May I use my status as a moderator and ask you a question which you started answering, in fact, what you see as the major sources of resilience of the Ukrainian people? It was such a great surprise for everyone that the Ukrainian David can stop the Russian Goliath and start to play an active role in pushing them out.
Look, I think part of the resilience comes from the fact that this war has been going on for 8 years before that, and we've seen it. And we have, Russians have killed 14,000 Ukrainians already in 2014, occupied Crimea, started a war in Donetsk and Luhansk. So that 8 years have, in a way, prepared Ukraine. If Russians invaded Ukraine at this scale, like they did in 2022, they did it in 2014. I'm not sure Ukraine would be able to stand or to resist. So those 8 years have prepared us to the war as a society. We got used to that. We got used to the war. It was in the news all the time. In the international news, it was only for 2014, 2015, and then it kind of vanished, right? So for the rest of the world, the war was gone, right? But the war was still in Ukraine. It was daily in the news. But also that those 8 years, we've done a great deal in terms of training our troops. Also, people who've gone through combat, their experience was very important. And the society and also like civil society was prepared because in 2014, we've seen a huge outburst of different NGOs and volunteer groups who were out there jumping to help military with the war, either providing supplies, sometimes raising money for military equipment, just unbelievable. Our volunteers go out there and can fundraise, and you've seen it in Poland, by the way. I think there was one famous TV anchor or radio anchor who raised 5 million euro for a Bayraktar, which is this military drone, and I think he's done it like in several days. I think he followed the example of a similar guy in Lithuania, also doing the same thing. So we see the crowdfunding driven by general population, not only in Ukraine but also throughout Europe. And I think that also gives you a lot of, and this is what gives inspiration. This is what contributes to your resilience, right? And look, and also, it's an existential war for us. We just don't have any other options. For Russians, it's the war of choice. For us, it's a war of, we don't have any other options. We just have to fight. And because if we don't, we are gone. We're done. There will be no more Ukraine. The sovereignty will be destroyed, and the country will be gone, right? So for us, it's an existential war, and we just have to be there. We are out there in the trenches fighting. Also, I think we already see a new generation of Ukrainians, right? And this is also very important because if you look at people who are running the country now, many of these people don't know Soviet Union, to be frank. I am 41. Zelensky is 45. My foreign minister is 41. Prime Minister of Ukraine is 46. We don't really remember Soviet Union. We are a different generation. If you look at the generations who run Russia, this is still generation over 70, who still reminisce at times when they were young, and they reminisce at times of the Soviet Union, when Soviet Union was feared and respected. This is something they want to renew. For us, we already a generation of Ukrainians who've seen the world, who studied abroad, who traveled to Europe, who want to be part of the European Union, who want to be part of NATO, We just see how life has changed in Poland once you join NATO, once you join the European Union. This is what we want for us. This is where we belong, and this is where we want to be. And this is something for Russia which is very difficult to grasp. For them to see Ukraine join or actually have an aspiration to have its own sovereign foreign policy is already a challenge. Secondly, to see Ukraine as a democratic country, to see Ukraine re-electing its leaders, those we don't like, to see free media in Ukraine. This is something which was a threat to Putin and his regime. And therefore, he just couldn't tolerate it. It was too much. Despite all the propaganda, there's still, you cannot hide it, right? Russians aren't stupid, right? They still see what's happening in Ukraine. They've seen the change which has been happening in Ukraine. So I still hope there are still many Russians who believe there is future, there is democracy in Russia, and there is a chance for it. But I have to tell, majority of the Russians support this war. They support the war, and this is very sad. This is a fact. I don't know how we deal with that. How do we change the country? How do we change a nuclear country, right? In the Second World War, Germany had to be re-educated and denazified, and they had to go through that long period of asking for forgiveness, right? But that was imposed by other countries who won the war, right? In this particular case, do we have a way of how we can re-educate Russians or change them? I don't see it as an option because it's a nuclear power, right? And that's a challenge that the world is facing.
I remember your statement in Tasmania, which all my colleagues remember and quote now, about the difference between Ukrainian army and the Russian army, that in the Ukrainian army, about 60% of soldiers have some academic record, while in the Russian army, about 60% of soldiers have criminal record.
Exactly. That's what it is. They have this Wagner mercenary group, which has been pretty much financed by the Kremlin oligarch, and he's been recruiting many people in jails and sending them to the front lines in large numbers to be killed quite quickly. Some survive, but very few. But they use it as a cannon fodder to identify our positions. And just to, sometimes I know our soldiers been running out of bullets because there's so many of them coming, and this is really, horrendous scenes. These are like scenes from the First World War, actually, not even Second World War. It's very close combat, urban combat, and it's really unbelievable that in the 21st century, in the middle of Europe, we're seeing that happening.
I would like now to ask Gosia Klat, who registers people who wanted to ask questions, to address these questions and listen to your responses and comments. Gosia.
Thank you, Janku. No, we don't have anything in the chat, but we can open for questions from everyone who would like to ask a question on the floor. So just raise your hand and I will try to spot you, or just start speaking, please. Who is first? I'm just checking. Everyone is very shy today. Oh, Alex, go ahead, please. I just unmute yourself. Okay.
So I personally am worrying how long this support for Ukraine from the countries around the world will last. Will there be a fatigue of some sort, or other aspects, economic and other connections, this pushing pushing governments away? And why do you think, and how do you interpret that the Western countries who now, and Western European countries who now support Ukraine, will last all the way till the victory?
nobody can predict how it's going to go in the future. And of course, that's a bet that Putin is making, that you all will get tired of it. And politicians will want to just to end it. And he initially thought that there would be no unity in Europe, having Germany so much relying on the Russian gas. It didn't work out. And the unity is still there. There might be a bet on the elections in the US if there is a new president elected, and that's president is someone we know, but someone who may actually change the whole dynamics. Let's just face it, a lot depends on the US government, right? In this whole game, and the changes to it may differ. So far, so good. We've managed to maintain that focus on Ukraine, and assistance is coming. We've been able during the past year to unlock many different new platforms for Ukraine, which have helped Ukraine a lot. Initially, as you remember, we only would get some anti-tank missiles, which we pretty much were getting as everybody was getting ready for a guerrilla war where Kyiv would fall and there would be war elsewhere, right? But then the other allies have unlocked other systems and air defense systems and multiple rocket launchers and the supply of artillery and now the supply of tanks. What we need to unlock and what we need to get is jets. We need to get jets to win. And if last year it was about defending Ukraine, this year it's about winning the war. And it's important that that assistance continues and it's substantive, it's comprehensive, and it's consistent. And therefore, this is something that the Ukrainian government is working on, making sure that we can get enough in time for that major counteroffensive against Russians in the coming spring.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Peter Sobies, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, it's too many things at once. First of all, Vasyl, I really admire your presentation. It's the first time I had a chance to watch it, and something I was repeating for many years now. This is all my fault because I couldn't convince a single friend from my classroom that what's happening in Poland, what's happening or what used to happen in US, I'm referring to Trump and Kaczynski. I never managed to convince those people who voted for Trump or who voted for Kaczynski, or we have many other examples. So how does it relate to Ukrainian situation now? First of all, yes, I was impressed, as you were, with a stand of both people in Poland, and obviously government had to at least permit this to happen. So that's great. But it's not that simple. How do we, what are the underlying issues? What are the underlying causes that people still do vote for, as example, Kaczynski or Trump? Okay, this is all philosophical, and Vasyl, you prompted me to think about this. Probably the simple question is what an individual like me or 31 participants in this discussion can do. Obviously, we can't compete with Biden or UK Prime Minister because those are the billions of dollars. But is there anything you can think we can do to help? Should we establish some direct connection with people in Ukraine? Should we promote your presentations? Okay, I probably should.
Yeah, look,
stop.
Peter, thanks a lot for the question. Look, I understand you're all throughout Australia and you're all based here, and I think you're all Australian citizens. So I think what's in a nutshell, I call on you to write a letter to your member of parliament, to write a letter to your senator, and ask for assistance for Ukraine. You could also initiate a meeting with your member of parliament or a senator who represents you and ask them what they do for Ukraine and what they've done for Ukraine, what's their plan. And you can explain why it is so important for Australia to support Ukraine. And I think this will be a great help, because at the end of the day, it all comes down to the initiative from the grassroots. And this is what politicians react to. They need to see that initiative. And there are so many different ways how you can do it. And I understand we have people here from different walks of life. So I don't really know your backgrounds, what you've been doing, what you are currently doing. But I'm sure there is a very vast talent here and that we could tap in. And I'm sure there are people who write, who can write an op-ed in your local newspaper or even national newspaper, or maybe there are others who can organize some tours and of lectures of somebody either from Ukraine or from Europe, who come and talk and educate general Australian public about Ukraine, about Ukrainian history, about this war. So there are different things, and often you can just come to a charity in your city, which is raising money for Ukraine and support it, right? But I'm happy to brainstorm it with you, and I'm sure you have your ideas often on your own. But I think it often comes down to the initiative, somebody being proactive and just doing it, right? Doing it on your own and just taking the initiative and serving as an example to others, and others will do so as well. So this is just an ask to you, yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the question as well and for the suggestions. And the next question comes from Jan Kozłowski. Please unmute yourself as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm still in Poland and watching situation from Polish point of view, but soon I will be, in a week, I will be in Australia. My question is, of course, I believe that Ukraine will win and will be rebuilt as a modern country. For me, it's sure. But Russia probably will still exist. You have very long border with Russia, relatively long border with Australia. How it will look? What are your ideas about situation? Do you think you will be in position like Israel, surrounded by Russia, with missiles coming to Ukraine and kind of defense that will save you, or do you think that Russia will split to smaller countries? What do you think?
Look, yeah, geography is out there to stay. I wish we had Australia as a neighbor. If you know how we can achieve it, that would be really a good solution. And we would love to have a long border with Australia, but not Russia. But while we are working on this challenge, we have to indeed think about what's the future, right? I still believe there will be a day when we wake up and Vladimir Putin is gone, right? It will happen sooner or later, and hope it comes sooner. I think that will lead to a collapse of that house of cards pretty soon, as different leaders of different intelligence agencies and military and others will start fighting for the top job, mostly killing each other on the way there. There is a competition out there, but then it's not going to change Russia that much. But maybe the third person who will be out there will change. But I think that it may all collapse pretty quickly, and so I don't rule out this black swan kind of effect. At the end of the day, once we get Russians out of Ukraine, we'll also have to make Russia pay for the damage. We'll have to prosecute Russians for the war crimes. And we will have to come up with some sort of arrangement with Russia eventually, right? Once we restore our sovereignty. This will have to happen. And then, of course, some sort of reconciliation will have to happen. And we don't know how many years it will take, a generation or 2 generations, right? And especially we will have to do it with a democratic Russia. With current Russia, it's impossible. It's impossible to negotiate with these Russians. I mean, you can't negotiate with somebody who does not recognize your sovereignty. And I think it was Golda Meir who once said, and by the way, she's a famous, she was born in Kiev, and then she moved to Israel and became a prime minister there. And I think she was pretty clear when she said that you can't negotiate with somebody who doesn't believe you have the right to exist. And that's something we are actually seeing with Russia. If Russia does not recognize Ukraine as a nation, does not recognize us as a sovereign country, there's not much to negotiate there, to be frank. And that's unfortunately the reality. But look, it's a very complicated issue. We've all kind of many Ukrainians have relatives living in Russia. In the Soviet times, Ukrainians have spread out. I know that most of these relationships have been undermined because people living in Russia believe in what Russian television is telling them. So it's on my wife's side, on my side, we all somehow have some, distant relatives somewhere out there in Russia, which been pretty much, lost forever. But at the same time, there's still connections out there, right? And look, I don't know. I don't really know how it's going to go. What's clear is now that we see the resurgence of the rebirth of the Ukrainian nation, where all of this, because in Kiev is a bilingual city. In my company, I had 30 people, 50% of people spoke Ukrainian, other 50% spoke Russian, right? I'm a Ukrainian speaker, I always speak Ukrainian. But in Ukraine, we all understand both languages because being part of the Russian colony, right? We all were forced to forget our own language and learn the language of the oppressor, right? So the language was imposed on us, but it was imposed for such a long period of time that many people have lost their own language. So what I've seen now during the past year, and actually no, during the past 9 years, let's put it this way. So I had some Russian-speaking friends in Kiev who specifically switched into Ukrainian growing up their kids because they said, well, we lost our language with our parents, but our new generation will speak Ukrainian. And languages are very different. Well, we all kind of understand it's a Slavic language, it's similar, but it's like Polish and Italian. They're similar, but they're different. Russians don't really understand much of Ukrainian, to be frank. We all know Russian because we were forced to learn Russian. But Ukrainian is still, in many respects, for Ukrainians, as you know, Polish is pretty easy because, especially when I read Polish, I can understand 80% of it, right? Speaking is a bit more difficult because you have this extra sounds we don't have. But anyways, it was just generally being part of the Russian, and nobody looks at Russian history from a standpoint of colonialism. This is, by the way, something which is missing in the Western academia. And this is something that Russia has been able to harness in their global propaganda. Like when they spread their narrative in Africa, in Latin America, they all kind of built on that anti-colonial narrative. But nobody looks at Russia as being a big colonial power, which subdued all those Caucasus, Central Asia, and Eastern European nations, right? And when you kind of look from that angle, you get a different sense of what it is. But so far, there's still a lot to be done and a lot to achieve. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, I would like to ask a question.
Yes, go ahead, Beata.
Vasyl, I would like to ask you about that. How many people from Ukraine, how many Ukrainians decide move to Australia? I know that Australian government prepared big program and good program for Ukrainians. Sorry, I have problem with my camera. I have to turn off it. Sorry for that. So
look, not many.
Sorry. So no, yes, I discovered that because I collaborate with one immigration law office, and I saw that no one from our clients is from Ukraine. So because of that, I ask you this question. This is not a good destination for Ukrainians because of geological or what?
No, look, several different things. It's too far. It's too expensive to travel. Usually those who come who have some relatives here or they know somebody. Also, the previous Australian government had a good program for Ukrainians, which expired on the 31st of July. The new government has not renewed the program for Ukrainians, to be frank. So Ukrainians can now apply for general kind of protection visa and bridging visa. So actually, in the previously, they could even get some financial assistance to settle before they find a job. This has been phased out on the 31st of July and was never renewed by the new government. So actually, we have more visas issued than those who arrived, right? If we estimate that 7,000 people arrived, originally 9,000 visas were issued. So many people who got a visa when this program expired and they could make it here before that time decided not to come. I know Ukrainian community is working on that. To be frank, it's not a big priority for me because look, we need all those people back in Ukraine. I mean, that's a fact. So my job here is not to make life easy for Ukrainians, but I'm happy to assist those who are in need and who come here in temporary asylum. And Ukrainian community has been doing that, right? And also, if we look at numbers, we have 5 million in Europe, so 7,000 here. Maybe another 10 can come. Will it make a difference? Not much, to be frank. What we have to focus on, we have to focus that we win the war and these people can all come back to Ukraine to rebuild the country. This is what's important.
Yes, yes. And do you know how many Ukrainians are now in Poland?
Of 1.5 million people, from what I understand.
Thank you for your questions, Beata. Piotr Łubinski is next. Piotr, we can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry. I'm Piotr Łubinski from Kraków. I'm just preparing for another conference which is taking place today in Kraków, which is a launch of the book The War Must Go On at the Jagiellonian University. And just sort of like a short comment about the number of Ukrainians. We were privileged to be able to host a family of 5 and in my house, in the house of my recently deceased father. So it's a massive contribution. But I have a question to you, Mr. Ambassador, related with sort of like my personal experience. I was deployed to Afghanistan, and a number of people who were there in Afghanistan and then going back to Poland were affected by the post-traumatic stress disorder. This Russian aggression is marked by the most heinous crimes, including Bucha, Irpin, and a number of things. My understanding of the dynamics of the social dynamics is such that the number of people in Ukraine will be traumatized or highly traumatized by this terrible war, this terrible brutality of the Russian army. And I know that obviously right now the most important aspect of this situation is to just repel the aggressor and win this war. But I'm wondering whether Ukrainian government authorities are thinking about the sort of like a post-conflict solution, which includes the dealing with this trauma, because definitely Ukrainian society will be highly affected by this cruelty, and whether you are thinking about the rebuilding your society as a people who many of them were simply deeply traumatized.
Yeah, look, absolutely, Ukrainian government is working on that. The only problem is that we don't have resources, and we don't have. And nobody actually has experience of dealing with something like this at this scale, right? So we all know post-traumatic disorder syndrome, right? Which happens after you come from a wartime area, or you were in combat, for instance. But when we talk about 44 million people who are traumatized by the war, how do we overcome it? I mean, it's just the level and magnitude is so huge. I know many foreign governments and different organizations and psychologists, psychiatrists are being rolled out to work on what's the plan, how do you actually do it? How do you provide that service, right? How do you identify people who need it? How do you tell people that there is a way you can get assistance, and who's going to train those people who will provide that assistance? And what are the needs? How many of those people? I mean, this is all there. I by the way, I'm looped into some of the similar stuff which is happening out of Australia. My wife is heavily involved in some of similar work, and we've seen how Australia can support Ukraine. But we'll need support from all over the world, and of course there will be lots of issues of how do you actually adapt all of that to Ukrainian environment. How can you all adapt to the local and localize that, right? And how do you make it practical? Because often if you don't have the language, you need to train Ukrainians who will then provide the training, who will then provide therapy, and will provide assistance. and probably there will be different levels because a lot of people will need actual psychiatric assistance. Some people will just need psychological assistance and therapy and other things, but depending on how affected they were and where they were, during the war. So you're right. I mean, it's a big, and how that's going to affect society for the next 20, 40 years, right? Nobody knows that yet. And but you're totally right. I mean, this is just, it's a huge challenge.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is a really important question and a follow-up to the end of the conflict, hopefully. I will ask for more questions from those who have not yet had a chance to ask.
I would like to comment once the last point about trauma. Of course, trauma will be present, but I hope it will not be so common, because the best cure for trauma is hope for future. So if you win and start to build, a lot of children will be born, and you will be so busy with building new Ukraine that trauma will not be so common as you think at present. This is my opinion, of course, and my hope.
Let's hope so. Thank you, Jan. I wanted to ask a question about the Russian diaspora in Australia. That's something that we really never mention and think about, but I am interested in checking with you if you have experienced any specific behaviors, or if you noticed something from Russians who live abroad, and or what kind of signs are there? Is there any communication established? Is there any support, or otherwise is there any zero communication? I don't know. Is there any relationship that you have with the Russian community in Australia?
Look, it's very limited. I met this Svoboda Alliance, which is a group of kind of the Russian Democrats who are based here in Australia. I've seen them at some conferences. I've seen them at some events in different cities. They've been very supportive, coming to demonstrations, raising money for Ukraine, helping Ukrainian refugees. Nevertheless, there are also many Russians who are out here, but they support Putin. They organize demonstrations in support of the war, spreading disinformation, propaganda, attacking me personally as well. So it's happening as well. So we, one of those guys is a guy called Ozzy Kozak, who's currently hiding in the Russian consulate. He's an Australian citizen of Russian origin, and he's probably was one of the most vocal in terms of generating huge publicity in Australia as an active actor, but also as a Putin activist, as I call him. But he's been pretty efficient in terms of reaching the audience. The audience that he's reaching is the audience on the far right, which is out here, anti-establishment kind of audience, which has a big following, by the way. And this is just one of the examples of how Russia can utilize, have different agents of influence, but also use different ways how they exert their malign foreign influence in a democracy. And this is just one of those, right? We hear about you've seen it in the news that ASO has cracked down on the Russian spy ring, right? And there's also an interesting development, and it's good to see it happening. And also, look, if you look at those Russians who left Russia during the past year, most of them left because they didn't want to be conscripted into the army. But I haven't seen those people necessarily going and protesting against Russia. Their motivation to leave Russia was not to be conscripted and get killed, but it's not necessarily that they don't support the war against Russia. You have to just be very clear about it, right? There are some exceptions, of course, but it's just much more complicated, because I think generally the support for this war in Russia is pretty big. It's huge. And I always say that if 2 million Russians went on the streets of Moscow, St. Petersburg, nobody could stop them. And you cannot put everybody in jail. And they don't do it. for different reasons, right? But we should ask that question, why not? And the question is pretty obvious. And that's unfortunately what we have, right?
Thank you. And I think the last question, we've got one more time. Anyone who hasn't asked a question, Marek Burdajewicz,
Yes.
go ahead.
I remember a couple of months ago, at the first year of the war in Ukraine, Professor Rothfeld was asked for how long the war will last. And his answer was definitely not measured in years, but in generations. So otherwise, whether the war will finish tomorrow or in a year time, it will be in people's hearts. My question is to Ambassador, would you be able to tell us roughly what is at the moment in the mind of those people who do the negotiation with Russia? Are there any hope to achieve anything? As far as I know, there were already 5 major trials which didn't succeed. What is the latest in this regard? Thank you.
Look, whatever is in the public domain, it's for the. I mean, any negotiations with Russians have stopped back in May, and no more, and no official negotiations were taking place with the Russians. Look, what Russians want now, they want to have a ceasefire. They want to dig in and basically occupy the oblasts that they don't actually fully control. They may get full control of Luhansk, but it's not complete yet. They only have full control of Crimea. The rest, they only control parts of different regions of Ukraine, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, right? So Russians need time, and they are asking for ceasefire, but there is no negotiations with Russia because for them, they need that time to resupply, regroup, and mount another attack. So they actually need time to produce more weapons to hit us once again, right? And they're not going to withdraw from any of the Ukrainian land that they have occupied. Actually, they've already annexed it and made it part of the Russian constitution. So for us, it's actually saving those people who are under the Russian occupation. And it's not that Russia wants any land. Russia does not want land. Russia wants to destroy our sovereignty. So I don't think you can really negotiate anything with Russia at this stage. Not with this leadership, and it's only the defeat on the battlefield. This is what they understand. The strength is the only thing that Russians understand, and that's the reality. And I think a lot of people who think that you can negotiate with Russia, they live in a dream. It doesn't work, and we've seen it throughout history. We've seen it throughout generations. It just doesn't work. I mean, it only works if you're ready to surrender. If you surrender to Russia, yes, call it a negotiation. But we back to differ. We're not surrendering. We are fighting. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And that was the last question that we would have asked. So thank you so much, everyone, for your attendance. And obviously, I will hand over to Janek to say the final thank you to the ambassador. Just unmute yourself, Janku.
Your Excellency, dear Vasyl, thank you very much for your presentation. And I would like to pass through you our best wishes to the brilliant leader of Ukraine at this hard time, President Zelensky, as well as to all Ukrainian friends who are paying with their blood, with their suffering, for the most valuable article you can ever have, which is freedom, sovereignty. So may I end with this thanks and optimistic thought that to many people, Ukraine has already won this war because it won a sense of importance of freedom and independence. This is irreversible. I'm so glad that you mentioned it. Other things are also important, but of secondary importance. Ukraine becomes a free nation, and this might require a very heavy price, but is something which future generations will be eternally grateful to the young people and older people who are fighting for freedom from the Russian tutelage. So thank you again, and may I extend also invitation to President Zelensky to visit Australia, but probably only after he receives a victory parade in Kiev. So
Absolutely.
thank you very much.
Good. Thank you very much.